There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Mr. Dillett, a collector of rare objects, has become a prisoner to his latest prize, a haunted doll's house. He has witnessed its ghostly play of murder and tragedy. Now, the final act is about to begin, led by the house's youngest and most sorrowful spirit, Mr. Julius Dillett, a man who had once prided himself on being the master of his own carefully curated world, was now a slave. His master was not a person, but a thing of wood, plaster, and glass. It was the doll's house. His magnificent, exquisite, and utterly malevolent purchase now sat in the center of his study, not as a prize but as a tyrant. It had ceased to be an object in his collection. It had become the dark, demonic sun around which his entire existence now revolved. The thrill of ownership had long since curdled into a state of perpetual low-grade terror. He was its captive audience, bound to his seat by a force more powerful than any physical chains. A morbid, soul-eroding fascination. Every evening the ritual was the same. As dusk began to bleed into the sky outside, a dreadful, magnetic pull would draw him to his study. He would try to resist. He would tell himself to go to his club, to visit his cousins, to do anything other than sit in that room. But his feet would inevitably lead him there, as if guided by an unseen will. He would sink into his leather armchair, a glass of brandy in his trembling hand, and he would wait. He had become a connoisseur of his own fear, a scholar of the horror that was about to unfold. He knew the players, he knew the scenes, and he knew the dreadful, inevitable progression of the plot. The performance always began with the bell. A faint, frantic, and impossibly tiny tinkling would emanate from within the miniature house, a sound that grated on his nerves and made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. It was the signal. The curtain was rising on the Golightly family's eternal tragedy. First came the sickness. He would watch, his breath held tight in his chest, as the doll figure of the old woman in the upstairs bedroom would be moved, her stiff form laid out in the tiny bed, a silent testament to a creeping illness. Then came the conflict. The two figures in the parlor below, the younger man and woman, would be rearranged into their familiar tableau of a bitter, silent argument. The anger and resentment in the house was a palpable thing, a cold, emotional poison that seemed to seep out of the miniature rooms and into the study itself. Dillett would watch, mesmerized, as the figure of the old man, the patriarch, would glide from his own room to stand, listening, outside his sick wife's door. The sense of malevolent, premeditated intent was so strong it was almost suffocating. Next, the murder. In a horrifying flash of movement, the old woman would be found thrown from her bed. Her tiny, wooden body sprawled on the floor in a broken, unnatural posture. The act of violence, though silent and performed by inanimate objects, was more shocking to Dillett than any real-life brawl he had ever witnessed. It was the cold, calculated cruelty of it that chilled him to the bone. It was a crime committed without passion, an execution carried out with a chilling sense of duty. And finally, the promise of more death to come. The grim procession of the dolls carrying the tiny, perfectly crafted child's coffin up the grand staircase. The placement of that dark, polished box on the bed, right beside the innocent, seated figure of the child doll. That was where the play always ended. The curtain would fall. The dolls would freeze in their final, horrifying positions, and a heavy, dreadful silence would descend upon the study once more. This nightly ritual of horror had become the new, grim rhythm of Mr. Dillett's life. He was trapped in a loop, a spectator to a tragedy on repeat. The first few times he had witnessed it, he had been paralyzed by sheer terror. He had tried to intervene, to move the dolls, to disrupt the performance. But it was useless. Every morning, he would enter the study to find the dolls perfectly reset, back in their original, polite starting positions, waiting patiently for night to fall so they could perform their terrible play all over again. He had come to understand that he was not just watching a haunting. He was being subjected to a lesson. The house was teaching him its history, forcing him to bear witness to the full, horrifying scope of the Golightly family's doom. But the story was incomplete. The most terrifying part of the nightly ritual was not what he saw, but what he didn't see. The play always stopped at that same unbearable cliffhanger. The coffin on the child's bed was a question mark, a terrible, unspoken promise of a final act that was yet to be performed. What happened to the child? Did it succumb to the same sickness as the grandmother? Or was its fate even more sinister? Did the same murderous hand that had thrown the old woman from her bed return to claim the youngest member of the family? The question haunted Dillett's waking hours and plagued his sleep. He would find himself staring at the doll of the child during the day, when the house was dormant. It was just a small, crudely painted piece of wood, its face a neutral, smiling mask. Yet, to Dillett, it had become the focal point of the entire tragedy. It was the symbol of the curse's ultimate cruelty, its willingness to consume not just the old and the infirm, but the young and the innocent as well. He began to feel a strange, protective pity for the inanimate object. He was its only witness, the only one who knew of the terrible fate that was foreshadowed for it every night. The unfinished story was a masterful piece of psychological torture. It left his imagination to fill in the horrifying blanks. He would picture the child doll growing weak, its painted smile seeming to fade. He would imagine the lid of the tiny coffin being lifted. He would see the small, stiff figure being placed inside, the lid being nailed shut. The scenes he created in his own mind were so vivid, so horrifying, that he sometimes felt he was going mad. The doll's house was no longer just showing him the past. It was making him a participant in its ongoing torment. He was caught in the same dreadful anticipation as the ghostly dolls themselves, waiting for the final terrible shoe to drop. The unfinished nature of the story was a hook that had lodged itself deep in his soul, and it would not let him go. He knew, with a certainty that filled him with both dread and a sick sense of resignation, that one night, the play would not stop. One night, he would be forced to watch the final act. He would finally learn the fate of the Golightly child. He did not know when that night would be, but he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house. The ghostly performances seemed to be growing more intense, more charged with energy. The tinkling of the tiny bell was more frantic. The movements of the dolls seemed quicker, more purposeful. It was as if the house were building towards a crescendo, a final, terrible climax. And Dillet knew that he was powerless to stop it. He was bound to his chair, a captive audience member in a theater of the damned, waiting for the final act of a play whose ending, he was sure, would be a horror beyond anything he had yet endured. The unfinished story was a gaping wound in the heart of the haunting, and he knew, with a sick feeling of dread, that tonight might be the night it would finally be closed. Tonight, the air in the study felt different. It was heavy, laden with a palpable electric tension, like the dead, still air before a lightning strike. Mr. Dillet sat in his customary chair, a glass of untouched brandy on the table beside him. He had long since abandoned any pretense of reading or distracting himself. His entire being was focused on the doll's house, his senses honed to a razor's edge by the grim, nightly ritual. He felt a profound sense of foreboding, a deep, instinctual certainty that this night would be different. The long, agonizing overture of the haunting was over. The final, terrible act was about to begin. He did not have to wait long. The performance began not with the usual frantic tinkling of the summoning bell, but with a new and far more ominous sound. From deep within the miniature house, the tiny bell began to toll. It was not a frantic ringing, but a slow, rhythmic, and deeply mournful chime. Ting, ting, ting. Each tiny, silvery note was perfectly spaced, falling into the oppressive silence of the study like a single cold drop of water into a dark well. It was not a call for help. It was a funeral knell. It was the sound of a death already in progress. A tiny, spectral death knell for the last innocent soul in the house of Golightly. A shiver traced its way down Dillet's spine. The change in the sound was a clear and terrifying signal. The rules of the play had changed. The cycle was not just repeating. It was progressing. His eyes were glued to the interior of the house, his mind bracing for what was to come. The first change he noticed was in the downstairs rooms. The dolls, which usually engaged in their own separate dramas of conflict and malice, were now still. The figures of the murderer and the other family members, the ones who had previously argued and conspired, were now gathered together in the miniature parlor. They stood in a stiff, silent semicircle, their small, painted faces all turned upwards, towards the ceiling, towards the child's room on the floor above. Their roles in the tragedy seemed to be over. They were no longer active participants in the evil. They had become its passive audience, a silent, waiting congregation of the damned, their gazes fixed on the final act of the curse they had helped to perpetuate. Their stillness was more unnerving than their movement had ever been. It was the stillness of spectators at an execution. Dillet's gaze shot upwards to the child's bedroom on the second floor. The scene there had also changed subtly, but with horrifying implications. The tiny, child-sized coffin, which was usually placed on the bed beside the child doll, was now open. Its miniature lid was propped up against the headboard, revealing the dark, empty space within. It was no longer a promise of death. It was a vessel, waiting to be filled. The doll figure of the child, which had always been depicted sitting upright in its bed, a picture of innocent health, was now lying down. With a slow, inexorable smoothness that defied its inanimate nature, the doll figure lay back against its tiny pillows. Its stiff, wooden body assumed a pose of profound weakness and weary resignation. It was the posture of someone succumbing to a long and fatal illness, someone who had given up the fight. The sight was a grotesque parody of a child settling down to sleep, but Dillet knew he was not witnessing a scene of rest. He was witnessing the final moments of a life being extinguished by the invisible, creeping poison of the family curse. The funeral bell continued its slow, merciless tolling, each chime a step closer to the inevitable, a countdown to the end. Dillet felt a wave of helpless pity wash over him, a feeling so strong it was almost painful. He was watching a child die, a tiny, wooden effigy of a child, but the emotion it evoked was terrifyingly real. He wanted to shout, to intervene, to snatch the doll from its bed and protect it from its terrible, preordained fate. But he was powerless, a spectator frozen in his seat, bound by the supernatural rules of the performance. And then, as he stared, mesmerized by the grim tableau, a new and final horror began to manifest. In the small, shadowed space at the foot of the child's bed, the air began to shimmer. It was the same phenomenon he had witnessed in his study a few nights before, when the life-sized ghost of the child had appeared to him. A faint, silvery mist began to coalesce in the miniature room, swirling and condensing. It was a ghostly vapor, pulling itself together, taking on a familiar, heartbreaking shape. It was the form of a child. A small, hazy, and translucent figure was slowly solidifying at the foot of the bed. It was not one of the original wooden dolls. This was a spirit, a spectral echo of the child whose tiny, wooden counterpart was now lying helpless in the bed. The ghostly child was pale and luminous, its form indistinct and wavering, as if it were a memory struggling to hold its shape. Its head was bowed, its posture one of profound, ineffable sadness. Dillet's breath hitched in his throat. He understood now. The curse was not just a reenactment. It was a ritual that summoned the very spirits of its victims. The house was not just showing him a story. It was forcing the ghosts of the Golightly family to relive their own tragedies, night after night. The appearance of the spectral child was the final confirmation. This was not just a play. It was a séance. A terrible, involuntary séance where the dead were forced to perform for the living. The ghostly child stood there for a long moment, a silent, sorrowful sentinel at the deathbed of its own physical effigy. The tiny funeral bell finally fell silent, its purpose served. The house was now utterly still, the silence profound and heavy, broken only by the frantic, panicked beating of Mr. Dillet's own heart. He watched, his entire being focused on the tiny, haunted room, waiting for the final, gruesome act, the placing of the child doll into its waiting coffin. But that is not what happened. The final act of the curse was not one of physical action. It was something far more intimate, far more insidious, and far more terrifying. The horror was about to shift from the visual to the auditory. The house was not just going to show him the end. It was going to make him hear it. The ghostly child at the foot of the bed began its sorrowful, final duty, and the haunting of Mr. Dillet was about to enter a new and soul-shattering phase. He had been the audience. He was about to become the congregation. The silence that followed the tolling of the tiny funeral bell was more terrifying than any sound that had preceded it. It was a silence that was not empty, but full. It was pregnant with a dreadful, imminent horror. Mr. Dillet sat bolt upright in his chair, his body rigid, every nerve ending screaming in anticipation. The scene in the doll's house was frozen in a ghastly tableau. The dying child doll in its bed, the open coffin waiting beside it, and the shimmering, translucent form of the spectral child standing a silent, sorrowful vigil at the foot of the bed. This was the precipice, the terrible, breathless moment before the final, irreversible plunge. As the ghost of the child stood its watch, the atmosphere in Dillet's study began to change once more. The room, which was already cold, grew colder still. But this was not the sudden, aggressive plunge in temperature he had experienced before. This was a slow, creeping, and deeply insidious chill that seemed to emanate directly from the doll's house itself. It was a cold that felt ancient and full of grief, a wave of pure, concentrated sorrow that rolled out of the miniature rooms and washed over him. The last few glowing embers in his fireplace, which had clung stubbornly to life, were finally extinguished, not with a sputter, but with a quiet, sighing surrender, as if the very heat were being drawn out of them by a spiritual vacuum. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen, to congeal. The familiar shapes of his own study, the towering bookcases, the heavy desk, the glass-fronted cabinets filled with his precious collections, began to recede into a thick, oppressive gloom. The only source of light was the single candle he had placed on a small table, and its flame, which had been steady, now began to shrink and wither, its halo of light contracting until it was just a small, lonely island in an ocean of encroaching shadow. The shadows themselves seemed to press in, no longer just an absence of light, but a tangible presence, a suffocating, black substance that was slowly filling the room, isolating him with the cursed object at its center. He felt a primal, claustrophobic terror begin to rise in his throat. The world was shrinking, his sanctuary becoming a tomb, and the doll's house was the sarcophagus at its heart. He was trapped, sealed in the darkness with the ghosts of the Golightly family, and he knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that he was about to witness something that no living person was ever meant to see or hear. And then, the sound began. It did not come from the bell. It was not a creak of the floorboards or a rustle of ghostly fabric. It was a voice. It started as a whisper, a sound so faint and high-pitched that at first, Dillett thought it was the ringing in his own ears, a symptom of his frayed and terrified nerves. It was a thin, ethereal hum, a single sustained note that seemed to hang in the air, trembling with a sorrowful energy. He strained to hear, his head tilted, his breath held fast in his lungs. The sound was undeniably coming from the doll's house. It was emanating from the upstairs bedroom, from the very spot where the spectral child stood its vigil. The hum slowly, delicately, began to resolve itself into a melody. It was a simple, repetitive tune, a melody of profound and heartbreaking sadness. The tune rose and fell with a gentle, rocking cadence, a rhythm that was instantly recognizable. It was a lullaby, but this was no sweet, comforting song meant to soothe a living child into a peaceful sleep. This was a dirge, a lament. It was a lullaby for the dying, a sorrowful, spectral melody designed to guide a departing soul from the world of the living into the cold, silent darkness of the grave. The melody was ancient, filled with a sense of loss so immense it felt as if it contained all the grief of the ages. Each note was a perfect, crystalline teardrop of sound, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It was the kind of melody that bypasses the ears and speaks directly to the soul, a tune that resonates with the deepest, most primal fears of loss and the finality of death. Hearing it, Dillett felt a fresh wave of that borrowed grief wash over him, a pain so sharp and so pure that it made his own heart ache with a physical intensity. Then the voice began to sing. It was the voice of a young child, impossibly clear and pure, yet thin and reedy, like the sound of wind whistling through a crack in a tombstone. It was a voice stripped of all earthly warmth, a sound that was both beautiful and utterly terrifyingly inhuman. It sang the words of the lullaby, and though Dillett could not yet make out the meaning of the ancient words, the emotional intent was devastatingly clear. It was a song of farewell, a song of eternal sleep, a song of sorrow for a life cut short. Dillett stared, his mind reeling, at the scene in the doll's house. He could see the faint, shimmering form of the ghost child standing at the foot of the bed, its hazy, indistinct head bowed as if in prayer or concentration. And from this tiny, translucent apparition, from this creature of sorrow and memory, came this pure, clear, and absolutely horrifying song. The juxtaposition of the innocent, childish voice with the song's profound, deathly sorrow was a thing of monstrous, Gothic horror. The ghost of the child was singing its own effigy, its own past self into death. It was performing its own funeral lullaby, a ritual it was doomed to repeat for eternity. The performance was intimate, contained. The song was a secret shared between the ghost and the dying doll, a private ceremony of grief. Dillett felt like an intruder, a voyeur spying on a moment of profound and sacred horror. The song seemed to create a bubble around the doll's house, a space where the laws of time and reality were suspended, where the past was not just being reenacted, but was truly, horrifyingly present. He was not just watching a memory. He was in the room when it happened. He was a man who appreciated art and music, a collector of beautiful things, and he could recognize, with a detached part of his mind, that the song was a thing of exquisite, heartbreaking beauty. The melody was perfect in its sorrow, the voice flawless in its clarity, but its beauty was the beauty of a venomous flower, a thing that captivated the senses even as it promised a painful, agonizing death. The song was a weapon, and its target was not just the dying child in the doll's house. Its target was him. He was the audience for whom this terrible, beautiful performance was being staged. And as the song continued, its melody weaving its way into the very fabric of his consciousness, he began to feel that he was not just listening to the story of the curse. He was becoming part of it. The ghostly lullaby, which had begun as a faint, private lament contained within the miniature world of the doll's house, started to grow. It was not a sudden increase in volume, but a slow, insidious swelling of sound, as if an invisible hand were gradually turning up the dial on some supernatural device. The thin, reedy voice of the spectral child began to detach itself from its source. It seeped out of the tiny, haunted bedroom, passed through the glass-paned facade of the doll's house, and began to bleed into the oppressive silence of the study. The song was no longer just in the room. It was beginning to fill the room. The sound became unnervingly three-dimensional, the pure, high-pitched notes seeming to come from all directions at once. It echoed from the dark corners, resonated from the high, vaulted ceiling, and seemed to rise up from the very floorboards beneath Dillet's feet. He was no longer listening to a distant performance. He was now sitting in the very center of the orchestra, enveloped, surrounded, and besieged by the sorrowful, ghostly music. He felt as if the child's spirit was no longer confined to the doll's house, but was now loose in the study with him, standing right beside his chair, its cold, spectral lips whispering the deathly lullaby directly into his ear. The effect of the song on Mr. Dillet was profound and terrifyingly physical. It was more than just a sound. It was a force, a wave of pure, concentrated emotion that crashed over him and invaded his very being. The immense, unending sorrow contained within the child's voice was a tangible thing. He felt it as a deep, physical ache that blossomed in the center of his chest, a crushing weight of grief that made it difficult to breathe. It was a pain so intense it brought tears to his eyes, tears of a sorrow that was not his own, but was now being forced upon him. The unnatural, ancient melody of the lullaby began to work on his mind. The strange, off-kilter notes, the melancholic, repetitive cadencite was a tune designed to unmoor the listener from reality. He felt a profound sense of dizziness, a wave of vertigo so strong that the entire room seemed to tilt and sway around him. The last, flickering flame of his candle blurred and stretched, its light becoming a confusing, swimming smear in his vision. The darkness at the edge of the room seemed to pulse in time with the slow, rhythmic beat of the song. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, trying to anchor himself to something solid in a world that was dissolving into a nightmare of sound and sorrow. His body began to tremble. It started as a fine, uncontrollable tremor in his hands, but it quickly spread through his entire frame. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer, raw, supernatural power of the song. It was a melody that vibrated at a frequency that was fundamentally hostile to living things. It was a song of endings, a sonic poison that was attacking his nervous system, breaking down his composure, and leaving him weak, dizzy, and utterly terrified. He was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a child's song. And then, a new and even more horrifying realization began to dawn in the fog of his terror-stricken mind. It was a thought, an intuition, so dreadful that it almost stopped his heart. The lullaby was not just a historical reenactment. It was not just a song of grief for the long-dead Golightly child whose effigy lay dying in the doll's house. The song felt personal, felt current. He began to feel, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was terrifying, that the song was also for him. The ghost was not just singing about a past death. It was singing about a shared fate. The sorrow in the song was not just for one lost child. It was a lament for all the victims of the curse, a terrible, eternal chorus of grief for all those who had been touched by the house's evil past, present, and future. And he, Julius Dillet, was now one of them. He had bought the house. He had witnessed the curse. He had become a part of its story. And now, the ghost was singing for him, mourning him, welcoming him into its sad, spectral family of the damned. The lullaby was a prophecy. It was a recognition of his own inevitable doom. He was listening to his own funeral song, sung by a ghost before he was even dead. This horrifying realization brought with it a desperate, frantic need to understand. He had to know the meaning, the specifics of his fate. He focused all his waning concentration on the voice, trying to push past the overwhelming sorrow of the melody and listen to the words. The child's voice was unerringly clear, each syllable perfectly enunciated. But the words themselves were a frustrating, maddening enigma. They were not English, nor were they French or Latin or any other language he could recognize. It was an ancient, guttural tongue, a dialect that sounded as old as the stones of the house itself. The words were filled with strange, clicking consonants and long, mournful vowel sounds. It was the language of a time long forgotten, the tongue of the very first people who had lived and, perhaps, sinned upon this desolate piece of land. And within those strange, incomprehensible words, he knew, lay the secret. He was listening to the lyrical heart of the Golightly curse. The song, he felt certain, was telling the whole story. It was explaining the origin of the evil, the nature of the first crime, the reason the family was doomed to this endless cycle of murder and grief. It was all there, laid bare in the verses of this ancient, ghostly lullaby. But it was a secret he could hear but never, ever comprehend. The ultimate torture of the curse was not just to witness the horror, but to be given the explanation in a language he could not understand, to be shown the key to a lock he could never hope to open. He was being taunted by the truth, forever held just beyond the reach of his understanding. The song continued its slow, merciless assault on his senses, each incomprehensible verse driving him closer to the brink of madness. He was trapped in his chair, a helpless prisoner of a sound, drowning in a sorrow that was not his, listening to the details of his own damnation in a language he would never know. The ghost of the child continued to sing its terrible, beautiful, and secret-filled lullaby, its voice echoing in the darkness, a final, chilling testament to a curse that was as inescapable as it was eternal. The ghostly lullaby, with its ancient, incomprehensible words and its soul-crushing sorrow, continued to hold Mr. Dillett in its thrall. He felt as though he had been listening to it for an eternity, that the sorrowful, childish voice had become the only sound in the universe. His sense of self was beginning to fray at the edges, his own thoughts and fears dissolving into the overwhelming grief of the song. He was losing his battle against the curse's sonic assault, his mind teetering on the very precipice of madness. He closed his eyes, a part of him wishing for the end, for the silence to return, no matter what horrors that silence might bring. Then, as the song reached what felt like its final, most heartbreaking verse, it began to change. The pure, clear voice of the spectral child started to fade. It was not an abrupt stop, but a slow, sorrowful decay of sound. The volume diminished, the voice receding from the study, seeming to pull back into the confines of the doll's house. The notes grew thinner, more ethereal, until they were once again just a faint, whispery hum. The song reached its final mournful note, a single, high-pitched tone that hung in the air for a long, vibrating moment, like the last, dying resonance of a struck crystal glass. And then it was gone. Silence. The silence that descended upon the study was absolute, a profound and ringing void that was almost as shocking as the song itself. The absence of the lullaby was a physical sensation. Mr. Dillett took a deep, shuddering breath, the first he felt he had taken in an eternity. The air, which had been thick and heavy with supernatural energy, now felt thin and empty. The oppressive weight on his chest lifted, and the profound, borrowed grief that had been crushing him began to recede, leaving behind a hollow, aching emptiness. He slowly, cautiously, opened his eyes. The room was just as it had been. The darkness was still deep and profound, the single candle still casting its weak, lonely light. He looked towards the doll's house. The shimmering, translucent form of the spectral child was gone. It had performed its terrible, final duty and had faded back into the memory of the house. The grim tableau in the upstairs bedroom was now complete and utterly still. The child doll lay motionless in its bed. The tiny, open coffin beside it remained chillingly empty, its purpose now fulfilled not by a physical act, but by the funereal song that had just ended. The ghostly play was, at long last, over. The story, from the first sickness to the final death, had been told. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was almost paralyzing, washed over Mr. Dillett. His body, which had been rigid with terror, went limp. His head fell back against the soft leather of the armchair, and he felt a bone-deep weariness, as if he had just run a marathon or fought a long and brutal battle. In a way, he had fought a battle for his own sanity against the overwhelming power of a supernatural sorrow, and he was not sure who had won. He felt scoured, hollowed out, as if a vital part of his own spirit had been scraped away by the ghost song. He sat there for a long time, his mind a numb, buzzing blank. He was too exhausted to be afraid, too drained to even think. He just sat in the ringing silence, staring at the doll's house. The terrible, final image of its ghostly play burned onto his retinas. He had survived the night. He had survived the final act of the curse. But as the initial, profound exhaustion began to ebb, a new and far more lasting horror began to dawn on him. The ghost child's voice was gone from the room, but it was not gone from his mind. The silence of the study was absolute, but the inside of his own head was not silent at all. The song was still there. The chilling, melancholic melody of the lullaby was now playing on a loop in his consciousness. He could hear it as clearly as if the ghost were still singing beside him. The sad, rising and falling cadence, the strange, off-kilter notes, the heartbreaking rhythm of it was all there, a perfect, internal echo. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head as if to physically dislodge the tune. But it was useless. The melody was not a memory that could be pushed aside or forgotten. It had been imprinted upon his mind, burned into his very soul by the supernatural force of the haunting. It was a permanent scar, a ghostly tattoo on his consciousness. He knew, with a certainty that filled him with a fresh wave of quiet, desperate despair, that he would never be free of it. He would hear this song for the rest of his life. It would be the background music to his every waking moment, the soundtrack to his every dream. It was the curse's parting gift. He had bought the doll's house as a collector, a man who sought to possess and understand pieces of the past. He had succeeded in the most horrifying way imaginable. He now possessed a piece of the Golightly family's past so intimately that it had become a part of him. He carried their sorrow, their tragedy, their song of death within him. He was no longer just the keeper of the cursed artifact. He was a cursed artifact, a living vessel for the family's eternal grief. The first pale gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows of the study, signaling the end of the long, terrible night. The coming of the day brought no comfort, no sense of relief. It only served to highlight the grim reality of his new existence. The ghostly play might be over, but the haunting of Julius Dillett had just entered a new, and perhaps eternal, phase. He had survived the performance, but he was now shackled to its memory. The house had shown him its secrets, the ghost had sung him its song, and he was now the sole, living heir to the whole, terrible, cursed inheritance. The melody played on in the silence of his mind, a constant, chilling reminder that while he may have bought the doll's house, it was the house, and its sad, singing ghost, that had ultimately bought him. And the price, he was beginning to understand, was his own peace, for the rest of his life. The ghostly play is finally over, its final act a song of death that now echoes in Mr. Dillett's soul. He bought the doll's house to own a piece of the past, but now, a piece of its cursed history owns him. Who do you think the ghostly child was singing about? And what terrible secrets were hidden in the words of that ancient, sorrowful song? Share your theories below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.